with that in mind, let me, introduce the person who really doesn't need much of an introduction, Bob Brown. I'll just simply say the leading expert on Westfield history. And so, go ahead.
All right. Some of you may have seen the preliminary story for this talk that was in the Westfield newspaper, and I made a comment about facts and history. I'm a professional historian, and my whole career has been as a professional historian, and that means I'm limited. Come on in, some chairs up front here, lots of chairs. I'm kind of limited to data. A historian needs data, facts, reports, documents, something. And of course, that's what this whole series last year and this year is about, talking about things that historians use to create history. Now, we're lucky in that this Athenaeum, this library, contains a massive collection of documents, things that historians can use. And all I've been doing now for, between 30 and 40 years, and the talks that I've given around town have all been based, we've got more chairs up here in the back, come on in. All these talks have been based on collections of things that are here in the library. There are more chairs up here in back, folks. The collection I want to talk about today is largely because of a man by the name of Roscoe Scott. Now, some of you who are older and long-term residents of Westfield may remember Roscoe Scott. He was the bureau chief for the Springfield newspapers here in Westfield. He was the bureau chief from 1927 to 1964. And not only was he the bureau chief, but he was noted, and the record was put in his obituary, that he was a pack rat. He saved everything. What he saved were hundreds of these envelopes. Anytime there was a story in the Springfield newspapers about Westfield, he clipped it. And he put it in a subject envelope. When we began creating the archives here in the late 1990s, there were file cabinets full of these envelopes, hundreds and hundreds of them. Now, not only did he save the clippings on the topic, but he also saved, if there was a letter to the editor, well, he saved a copy of the letter and shoved it in there. If the topic was based on a report, he would fold up the report and shove it in the envelope. If it was a meeting of a club and he had to write a little story about the meeting of the club, he had the club's agenda and he shoved it in the envelope. I've brought down just a few of the envelopes so you can see the masses of pieces of paper. Now, for most people, there are still a few chairs over here, folks. For most people, this is just not accessible, but I and other volunteers here have devoted the last few years to taking these out of the envelopes, Xeroxing them flat, making files, and putting them into the archive. So now if you said to me, I want to know something about Robert Chapin Parker, which is what this envelope, you would be able to get to a workable file that you could pull the information out and you could use. This is just not really usable. So what I'm talking about today is based largely on these files about hospital controversies and the hospital history that we've had here in the archives. We have other hospital documents. We have the hospital for many years published an annual report, and we have a number of them. Not as many as I'd like, but we have a number of them. And there, in the early years, they were wonderful reports filled with all kinds of data. Do you want to know the ethnicity of the patients? They kept that information. Do you want to know the kind of medical treatment that individual patients got by month? They're in here. By the time we get to the 1960s, the reports are largely just public relations documents. They don't contain that information. But in the early years, they were gold mines of information about Westfield. So I'm going to use Roscoe Scott and his files to talk about this Doctors Revolt, which has been totally forgotten in Westfield. Nobody knows anything about it. Let's begin in 1910 with the Flexner Report. Probably, again, nobody knows what the Flexner Report was, but the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation jointly were concerned about the state of American medicine. And they assigned Joseph Flexner to survey the state of American medicine. The Flexner Report of 1910 pointed out the following things. There were about 130,000 doctors in America in 1910. One half of them had their whole training as an apprentice. No academic training whatsoever. They had simply been an apprentice to another doctor like themselves. There were roughly 150 medical schools in America in 1910. Only 19 of them required a high school degree for entrance, and only 2 of them required a college degree. Half of them gave no clinical practice at all. In other words, you went to medical school, you sat in a classroom and got some lectures, and if you passed the lectures, you got a medical degree. You never touched or saw a patient at all. In fact, as late as 1885, Harvard, the piece de resistance of American medical training, the medical degree was offered for the taking of 9 courses, and you could fail 4 of them. And you could still get a medical degree. Obviously, the state of American medicine was appalling 100 years ago. Well, this laid the basis for a long process of certification and accreditation. Gradually, based on this information, there was so much outrage that various medical bodies were formed, and they began to create rules about who could be certified and how you could be certified. The idea is to gradually increase training, to make sure medical schools were certified, to make sure doctors were real things and advanced. That's the basis of medicine. In reality, prior to World War II, if you got sick in America, the state of medical knowledge and training and the tools that doctors had to work with meant that very little could be done for you. The best of American medicine prior to World War II was palliative. In other words, that means that's where the American popular cultural image of the good doctor comes from. A doctor who came to your house, a doctor who probably was elderly, a doctor who sat by your bedside, a doctor who cared for you. He couldn't cure you, but he could care for you. And that's sort of the cultural ideal that's floated through American medicine ever since. Now there's another part of that. Hospitals. The reality of American medicine prior to World War II was you only went to a hospital if you really were in disastrous shape and you kind of expected to die there. Now, that wasn't the hospital's fault or anything else. It was simply the realities of what was available to American medicine. All right? Now, once you've got that grounding, now let's talk about the Westfield case. By 1890, Westfield's population was close to half what it is today. We were close to 20,000 people, and within a few years, we would change the structure of the government and become a city. So Westfield was an industrial town at that point in time, and it was just beginning the big surge of new immigration, the Eastern European Catholic, Southern European Catholic immigrants. We were right on the cusp of that. In 1890, Reuben Noble died. This is Reuben Noble. I know you can't see very well, but I'll leave it up front. Reuben Noble was a very prosperous and successful tobacco farmer in town, engaging businessman, banker. He was very, very successful. A few years prior to his death, he had needed surgery for something. And he was upset that he had to be cared for in his home. He was upset that Westfield, there was no hospital, there was no medical facility in Westfield in 1890, and he thought it didn't make sense to have this kind of care in his home. So when he died in 1890, he left $40,000 to establish a surgical hospital. Now that was an important qualification. It would be for surgical patients only. And he set up a self-replicating board of trustees to govern it. Now, the doctors in town didn't think much of this idea. We have the newspaper articles from the time, and the doctors say, we don't need such a place. The only people who are going to use it are poor people. We don't need it. We don't think it's necessary, but we should never look a gift horse in the mouth. We're going to take the money anyway, and we'll build something small because we just don't need a hospital. It should have about 15 beds, and that should serve us for the next 50 years. So they built, in 1927, Noble Hospital. This is Noble Hospital. It opened in 1897, 7 years later. I have no idea why it took them 7 years to build it, but it did. It was very small. It didn't serve much. And so in 1903, Louisa Keep donated $100,000 in memory of her recently departed husband. And by the way, the little looking I've done, I don't know much about her husband. He was not born in Westfield. He's from one of the nearby hill towns. And he spent most of his life in Westfield. He's described that he made his money from shirt manufacturing. There was no such factory in town, so I don't know where he made his money. But anyway, his widow decided to honor her husband, and she donated $100,000 to create a hospital for disease, for medical care. And in fact, they built a parallel hospital. It looked just like the Noble Hospital, but there were two separate hospitals sitting side by side, one for surgical and one for medical, and she said there should be training for nurses. And so there were beds. The Keep Hospital had 15 beds for patients, but there were rooms in the attic for nurses. And this was going to be a nurses training program. And by the way, Noble Hospital, etc., would continue to train nurses until the mid-1930s. The original requirement for nurses was 12-hour shift, 6 days a week, 50 weeks a month, for 3 years, $10 a month pay. Now, even in 1910, $10 a month was below the amount you gave to beggars on the streets. And these were nurse trainees. These were young girls, and they did all the slop work. That's what they did. Conditions didn't improve much over the next 25 years. Nurses training continued at the hospital, but it didn't get much better. But they provided the labor in the hospital. This still wasn't considered satisfactory, and in 1930, Lily S. Lilly gave $500,000 in honor of her recently departed husband, Judge Joseph Lilly. And again, I don't know much of anything about him, and I don't know where a judge got that kind of an estate, but she donated $500,000 and a piece of property. The property would adjoin these buildings. And this is what was created by the time we get to the beginning of my story. The Noble Hospital over here, the Keep Hospital over here, and the intervening buildings are the Lilly Hospital. And just to complicate things, there's a fourth hospital, the Hazleton Hospital, which was across the street, and that was for OB-GYN. So Westfield, in fact, up through the late 1930s, had 4 hospitals that were only roughly governed by the same body. All right, there's the state of medical business and hospitals in Westfield in 1930. In September 1930, there's a headline in the Springfield newspapers. The head of the hospital blames the doctors for the loss of Class A status. This was an interview with attorney Henry Ely, very prominent attorney in town. He had been, he was the 20-year chairman of the board of trustees of the hospitals that governed all of this. He, by the way, was the father of Joe Ely, who's going to be elected governor of Massachusetts the next year. The hospital was accredited. Remember Flexner and accreditation. The hospital was accredited by the American College Board of Surgeons and Physicians. And they set up classifications of accreditation. The most desirable accreditation was A. And Noble Hospital had been A. In their review of the hospital in 1930, they said, this hospital's got a lot of problems. You're going to lose your accreditation. One of the things is your discharge records are appalling. We can't tell what happened to a patient after the patient came in here. Your records of patient care aren't much better. When you remove tissue surgically, you just throw it away. You don't send it to a pathologist, you don't check it, you don't evaluate whether it's proper or not. You've got to change that. You have got to get someone professional to run your laboratory. You're just sending one of these nurse trainees down to the lab to do whatever tests you want done, or a doctor when he's got a free time. You got to do something about that. And in addition, your superintendent says that the doctors are refusing to come to meetings when he calls. Henry Ely says, that's right. The doctors refuse to pay any attention to the superintendent that we've appointed to run the place. They're incorrigible, they're impossible, and I'm giving this interview because I'm appealing to the public to put the pressure on the doctors to make things better. I, as a historian, am forced to rely upon the documents I've got. Now, these events right here, I mean, that's 90 years ago. There's no one alive who can tell me what happened. So I've got to rely upon the records, and I can tell you that then there's a news blackout. There's no further information. But what I think happened is this. This is right at the moment that the Lilly $500,000 becomes available. And I think the combination of that $500,000, which will allow change and reform and hiring of staff and things like that, I think that $500,000, plus look at the date. We're right in the depression is breaking out and just going to destroy everything. I don't think anybody's going to rock any boats in these early years of the Depression. So things go quiet. What I do know is that the hospital kept its A rating. And things are quiet for 9 more years. Until January 31st, 1939, when there's another headline in the Springfield newspapers. This headline is, 9 doctors resign from the staff at Noble Hospital in dispute. And it's a very long article giving the background to a disaster at the hospital, at this hospital. The story begins, and I'm checking because I want to make sure I give you the right dates. The story begins in September of 1938, a year earlier. At that point in time, the executive board, the executive committee of the staff of Noble Hospital requested that the trustees would order the doctors on the staff who had not passed the American Board of Physicians certification to take the exam and pass it. In other words, there were doctors on the staff that had never been certified. The Board of Trustees agreed. Now, I want to stop just a minute because the board is going to become very important to make sure we talk about the board. When this whole business was set up, Reuben Noble had established the board that would govern it. And he did one thing that was unusual. The board is 9 members. It is self-replicating. In other words, it will pick its own replacements. It will create its own rules and pick its own chairman. And by his will, 4 of the members had to be wives of businessmen in town. Now that was a very strange qualification for 1890. So it's an unusual board by any standards. The board agreed to this request of September 1838, and it said, you're right, everybody should take and pass. We shouldn't have doctors who haven't passed the qualifying exam. So they ordered them to take it, they took it, they passed. A few months later, the same executive committee said to the trustees, you have staff members here who are graduates of Class C medical schools. We want you to remove them from their rights to surgical practice. Now, when this Flexner report had created accreditation, it first of all forced the closure of the pure diploma mills, and it shut those down. Then it graded medical schools from A, which were the best, B, which were okay, and C, they held their nose and said, you know, these guys are bad and we hope they die and go away. There were doctors on the staff who were graduates of C medical schools. Now, this controversy is going to go on for a couple of years. And I can't tell from the newspaper reports who they were or how many there were. But the trustees refused to remove them. It said, these men, and they're all men, have given us between 6 and 30 years of good medical service. We're not going to cut the rug out from underneath them. We're not going to do that to them. And depending on the article I'm reading, there were either 2 doctors in that category or there were 5, as many as 5. I can only identify one. And this is the man that I can easily identify. Dr. Arthur Schumacher. This library has a little claim to fame. Dr. Schumacher was the last civilian, and his children were the last children to live in what is today the Boys and Girls Library. After he left, a private family never lived there again. So Dr. Schumacher lived there. Dr. Schumacher was nearly 80 years old by this time. He was born in the 1860s. He came to Westfield to practice medicine in 1895. He was a very prominent physician in town and much beloved. He was the classic old country doctor. He was the town physician for nearly 30 years. He was the school physician for 25 years. He was the chairman of the Board of Health in town for 10 or 15 years. During the great influenza epidemic of 1919, he worked himself to exhaustion visiting patients in their homes. He was a great medical reformer in town. He called for the creation of a pest house, an infirmary, and he was the doctor for the infirmary. That, by the way, was out Route 20, out near the town poor farm. That was for isolation cases. He was a great believer in health. With one problem. He was a homeopathic physician. Now, that's a type of doctor that has almost vanished in America today. But in the turn of the century, there were a great many homeopathic physicians. Remember I told you that medical care, you know, doctors really couldn't do very much for you in medicine. And in fact, many of the things they did do to try and help you were deadly. Homeopathic physicians had a rather strange philosophy. It isn't science. I'm not quite sure what it is. Homeopaths said, what we need is to find in nature things which, if we gave them to you, would cause you to have the same symptoms that you're exhibiting right now. In other words, if you've got a cough and a fever, what natural things out there could make you cough and get a fever? Now, what we're going to do is, once we've accumulated all these, and they used to sell chests, once in a while you see them on the Antiques Roadshow, chests of hundreds of medicines in a box. Once we've identified what that thing is, we're going to take a infinitesimally minuscule amount of that substance and put it in a liquid and give it to you. Now, and that will cure you. Now, this doesn't even make sense, but it was homeopathic medicine. And Dr. Schumacher was a graduate of the Hannaford Homeopathic Medical School in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the 1880s, and he had practiced in Westfield most of his life. He was much beloved. He was old. He was the chief anesthetist at the hospital at this time, and he was a surgeon. He was practicing surgery. Probably not good medicine. And the doctor said, you've got to get rid of him and whatever other doctors there were in his case. Either there was one more or there were as many as 4 more. Well, the trustee said, we're not going to do it. A few months later, the American Board of Surgeons and Physicians comes along for their evaluation, and they said, this hospital's got problems. You've got to hire a full-time pathologist. You've got to hire a full-time X-ray technician. You've got to hire a full-time trained lab technician. They still weren't putting anybody in the lab. You have got to improve the physical conditions here. These buildings are deteriorating. You've got to bring in professional nurses. You can't have these high school girls serving as your nurses anymore. You've got to do this. Oh, and by the way, you've got to get rid of those Class C doctors and agree to not hire any more. The trustees said, we agree we will do all of the above, but we won't fire those doctors. At that, 9 members of the medical staff, all graduates of Class A schools, resigned, including the chief of staff, a man by the name of Edward Smith, the chief of surgery, a man by the name of Dr. Ritchie, and 7 others. They said, we quit. We can't stay here if you're not going to be certified. If you lose that Class A certification, then that means that no interns will come here because that'll harm their training. It means that we won't be able to hire other highly qualified staff because they aren't going to work at a hospital that's not certified. It means when we go on looking for another job somewhere else, people will say, oh, you come from a place that's not certified? We don't want you. We're not going to work here anymore. Now that left 8 doctors on the staff. Among them were either 2 or as many as 5 Class C doctors. I don't know how many. Dr. Schumacher is one of the people who's there. Rumors float that the 9 are going to Wesson. 1 week later, there's another headline in the paper. The trustees strike back. They say, okay, you guys, you quit. You lose your privileges at the hospital. Now, what that meant for those of you without medical background, if you have privileges at the hospital, that means your patients can go there and then you can go in and treat your patients in the hospital. If you don't have privileges, your patients can still go to the hospital, but you can't go near them. So suddenly, for the citizens in town, because all these doctors are local doctors, suddenly here are 9 doctors whose patients are facing the possibility that maybe they can't go to the local hospital. In the same news report, the trustees announced that they have just hired 7 more consulting doctors. Now, they don't say they're staff. They say they're consulting doctors so that they will have bodies on board. And they are doctors from the small hill towns. Now, I have identified at least one of them as also being a homeopathic physician from the Hahnemann School in Philadelphia. So they brought in at least one more doctor who's exactly the same problem that the accrediting agency says you can't have on the staff. By the way, Schumacher is very old at this point in time. He's going to retire almost immediately. And he also, at the same time, because of his age, is forced to retire from all his jobs in Westfield. Westfield hires the new homeopathic guy to replace him in all those jobs. Well, we've got a massive impasse in town. Half the doctors at the hospital have quit and say the hospital is in terrible shape. The accrediting agency says it's going to pull the records, pull the accreditation from the hospital. Numerous citizens in town saying, what happened? I can't go to the hospital with my doctor anymore. There's outrage throughout the town, and there are weeks of newspaper stories. Now remember, the stories are in the Springfield newspaper. Westfield only had a half-hearted advertiser at this point in time, almost nothing in it. The town has committees. The Grange creates a committee of citizens to attempt to negotiate this and solve this problem. The Kiwanis Club creates a committee of citizens to solve this problem. Mayor Burke is just elected at this point in time. She appoints a mayor's committee to investigate and solve this problem. So for weeks, you've got articles in the paper of one committee and another, and negotiations and letters from the trustees and letters from the doctor. And it is clear there's an impasse. At the heart, the impasse is over who's in charge at the hospital, whether it's the trustees or it's the doctors. That's essentially the impasse. And to some extent, it is, and when I look at the trustees are almost all elderly establishment figures. To be quite honest, their response is, who are you to tell me how I'm going to run my hospital? There's a large part of that going on. Well, it goes on for weeks and then months. Finally, in desperation, the 3 committees get together and say, we've really got to solve this problem. And they appoint a committee of 2 Frank Stanley Beveridge, and Judge Florence Burke to go and negotiate. Now, there's a little problem with this negotiation. The chairman of the board of the trustees is a man by the name of Hall. In town, his history is he's the force behind the creation of Barnes Airport. He's an entrepreneur. He's not a businessman per se, as he is a public relations man, a community man. He had been chairman of the Chamber of Commerce for years. He does promotions for the chamber. Frank Stanley Beveridge was the vice chairman of the Chamber of Commerce. And when this mess starts, Hall and Beveridge apparently have words, because Hall suddenly resigns from the chamber and never goes near it again. And Beveridge takes over as chairman. But Beveridge has got a lot of muscle in town, and Florence Burke isn't bad, and you've got almost every other businessman and association in town putting pressure on the board. In the spring of 1940, the board says, okay, if the 9 apply for their jobs back, we'll consider it. The 9 do. And 2 weeks later, the board announces that it has agreed to hire 7 of the 9 back, but it will not take back Smith, the former chief medical officer, the chairman of the governing committee of the hospital, and by the way, he's also the chief medical examiner for Hampden County. Nor will it take back Ritchie, who is the chief of surgery. It won't take back the 2 men they consider to be the leaders of the revolting staff. At that, there's a blackout. The news stories stop. Absolutely stop. There's no clippings. I went to the Springfield newspaper office. There are no stories. What I can tell you is this, that in June of 1941, 7 of the 8 physicians who stayed at the hospital, less Shoemaker, who's retired, 7 of them create a group medical practice in town. It's in the Medical Arts Building. It's the building, the old Greenaw House on the corner of Pleasant and Court Street. And they create a group practice. Now, they stay on the staff, but they clearly have decided they're going to function together. This is the first group medical practice in Westfield. Furthermore, in 1944, I have to jump that far before I get a story that'll help me in my story. In 1944, the hospital still does not have an A rating. And Ritchie is back on the staff. Smith never comes back, but Ritchie is back. Now, you have to look at what's happened in between. My story stops in the late fall of 1940. There's a news blackout, and then I jump to 44. Well, you've got World War II in there in between. Suddenly, the Springfield newspapers, this little squabble that's been going on for a year and a half in Westfield, is not worth covering anymore, particularly since it's low key. There's obviously some kind of negotiations going on. It's not a big news story. They're not covering it. And Westfield doesn't have a newspaper. But as late as 1944, there is a newspaper report that says the hospital does not have its A rating. And the reason it has this newspaper story is because the sanitarium out on East Mountain, there's a news story about it getting an A rating. And in that news story, it says Westfield has not gotten its back. So that's how I know that. I have a couple of trustee annual reports from the late 40s and the early 50s, and there's Richie on the staff. I know he's there. I know 2 other doctors are there, but not finding the rest of them is not surprising. Remember, in World War II, what you've done is you've pulled all the younger, better doctors out of practice. You put them in the service. So because they're not on the staff doesn't mean they couldn't be on the staff or they weren't on the staff. Suddenly doctors become very mobile, and I've got no guarantees of anything, but I know Richie is back. The story just sorts of vanish. But there is one coda. In 1954, Dr. Archibald Douglas, who had been one of the 9 originally, one of the ones who had resigned, he went back to the hospital. We know he went back. In 1954, Dr. Archibald Douglas is the chief medical officer at the hospital. And he leads a second revolt. Now, this one gets lots of newspaper coverage and lots of controversy. Doctors don't leave, but it's doctor-led. And again, it's over accreditation. Again, by 1954, this hospital is outdated by everybody's standard. The accrediting agency, now they may have been back to A at this point in time. I can't tell from the stories. The accrediting agency has come along and it's raising questions again. It's saying you've got the following problems. You've got to solve them. The trustees say, okay, we'll solve them. We've got some money, we can put a patch on here, we can adjust this. And Dr. Douglas and other doctors say, no, you got to start over. This place is a dump. You need to build a new hospital. And there's a year-long struggle, once again, between the community and the trustees over whether you patch or you start over. Well, I think you all know the hospital that's sitting up there today is they built a new hospital. This is the last time that the trustees have direct, hands-on, day-to-day authority in the hospital. Now, yes, there's a board of trustees right through until they end up being consolidated in Bay State West. But between the 1954 struggle and that end, to a very large extent, the hospital is run by boards of doctors and professional managers. It isn't the trustees, once again. I'll give you a simple example. When I first began to have contacts with the library here, other than pure patron, there were trustees here who regulated the level of the window shades on the windows, who were still picking the books for the to go on the shelves. Trustees just don't do that sort of thing anymore. It's just not done. Well, 54 was the end. What is this story all about? It's part and parcel, like a number of the other stories that I've told over the years, the story of dragging and kicking this rather backward small town into the modern era. I've given talks on the Westfield Police Department and the Westfield Fire Department. It was much the same. It's really not until the 1950s, and then much more in the 60s, that change took place in Westfield. That the town ceased to see, or the people who ran the town were forced to cease to see the town as a little Yankee farming community that happened to have some industries out there that we made money off, but we didn't really get involved with because we didn't like those people. And force the town to create modern institutions. Unfortunately, I can't answer all the obvious questions I might have about this story because I don't have the documents. But if anyone in here knows anyone connected, I think all of the last trustees are dead now, but knows anyone, there must have been trustee minutes and more trustee annual reports from those early years. I can't imagine that Bay State was interested at all in them. If nothing else, I don't necessarily mean patient records and like that, I just mean trustee minutes or something like that. It may be that descendants of some of those trustees have some of those materials. We'd love to have them in here so we can finish the story. Thank you. Comments, questions?
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah.
And it's not a question. I want to show hands. Who was born in the dump?
I was.
When you said that, I went, perhaps that's where I was born.
Well, I mean, it was the hospital. Everybody knew this is a hospital. And I can tell you, I don't doubt what people got very good care up there. But from a modern approach, from what was then available in more progressive places, you could look at it and say, look, you're behind the times. You're not doing this right. That's essentially the approach. It's like Dr. Schumacher. For the standards of medical knowledge available prior to World War II, up to 1930. Dr. Schumacher retired in 1930. Given the state of medical knowledge, a doctor like Schumacher, who came to your home, who didn't do harm to you, who comforted you, who supported you, that's good medical care. In that time, the time passed. Yeah.
Dr. Arenstam was one of those that, when my children were young, came to the home when they were ill.
Yeah, I'm old enough that, now the doctor didn't really want to come to the home, and I understand that, but I remember the doctor coming to home, and I lived 7 miles out from the nearest town, and the doctor came out with his bag, you know.
I used to make house calls.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and I understand the reason. I understand the reasons why it's disappeared. Doctors can certainly have access to more stuff in their own offices than they do in the home, but there's a difference. Yeah.
I grew up in a small town in Florida in the 50s, and our only doctor was a homeopathic doctor.
Yeah, homeopaths were around. You know.
The homeopaths are still around. I've got friends who still prefer to go to homeopathic medicine.
Yeah.
They haven't disappeared.
Yeah, no, they haven't disappeared. But I can tell you that if you go back to Dr. Schumacher's time, they were much more common. They were around, and there were good reasons why they existed. I think that's important.
The other thing I want to say is my neighbor who passed away a couple years ago, her mother was the area's midwife. She was Polish, so it was the Polish community in Westfield that she was the midwife for, and the herbalist. So people wouldn't have gone to the hospital. They would have gone to Helen's mother.
Well, this is a thing I probably didn't emphasize as much as I should. When these hospitals were created, the doctors in town said, these are for the immigrant poor. We people don't need them. That's who's going to go. Yeah.
What was the physical site of those hospitals?
Essentially the parking lot at Noble Hospital today, the big parking lot. Yeah, it sat there, and they just built a new hospital to the south, and that was on the land that Lily gave. She had given that land. Pardon?
Where the ER is, that side?
No, not the ER side. Where the main, the old the hospital main entrance is, that was the land that Lily gave. And then when that ER, that construction, that's what, in the late 70s, early 80s, there were houses up there. They took the houses down and built that, yeah.
It was ugly and scary. I can remember a child being there that was very ill. The beds were those iron beds. It was just.
Yeah, it was old. It was out of date. Yeah. Any others? Yes.
Behind, this would be roughly where the new parking lot is, where the emergency room is. There used to be a fish pond down there owned by H.B. Smith, and it drained down, there was a brook going down through, and the West Silver side of it was a hospital dump. And when we were kids, we used to go in there and fish out plastic bottles and things to play soldier. And there was a supervisor of nurses who was a World War I nurse, who later went on to become an anesthetist in a Philadelphia hospital, and it was my aunt, Teresa Supko.
Okay. Yeah.
I served as a trustee at Noble, so they had trustees right up until they
Bay State.
with Bay State. So I'm sure they must have kept the records there.
Well, that's what I assume. There must be records somewhere.
Yeah.
And I said, obviously, we're not interested in patient records or anything like that. But if nothing more than the annual trustee reports or the minutes of the trustee meetings, which I'm sure Bay State doesn't have the faintest interest in.
At all the meetings, and they had an annual report.
You know, that sort of thing really should be saved. It could be.
Noble Hospital should have those. In the record department, stored somewhere.
Well,
Because they had meetings every month and.
anyone who can push buttons, suggest to them, particularly the old ones. I mean, we got the records of Western Mass Hospital here a few years ago because the old records, particularly since they're not patient records, what are you going to do with them? They just take up space.
I'll find out from the hospital if they have any.
Okay, thank you. That'll be a good thing. Yes?
I was chairman of the board of the hospital when it almost failed a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And we tried to negotiate the first merger with Bay State, and they rejected us because our pension liability was so high. So we hired special lawyers that went to a pension review board in Washington, and they adjusted the pension, and then a new board put the merger through with Bay State, but we came that close to closing the hospital.
Yeah, well, the hospital, you're going to hear, and I won't admit to this outside this group because you're all a friendly group. I have spent decades doing these local history things and talking to these local histories. And one theme comes around again and again and again and again. Westfield is quite a wealthy community. Has been for a very long time. Westfield has a number of very successful private institutions. YMCA, the library, the cemetery, various things. None of which have been supported very strongly. And even the hospital, which had hospital drives and various fundraising things, it never really had a big endowment. It never really had large resources available to it, even during these years, and particularly during these years. Up through the beginnings of the Depression, the town's contribution to the hospital was $5,000 a year. That was the town's contribution. That and the annual harvest week. Simply because it's fun. During these early years, there was a week in which donations from the community were sought to support the hospital. It's not big piles of cash. David Mosley gave 5 bushels of potatoes. D. Campbell gave 2 squash. Mrs. George Easter gave a can of fruit. Mrs. Drake gave 14 glasses of jelly and a can of pickles. This was not a community that was generous in support of its community assets. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.